Have you ever wondered what it would be like to wake up one morning and discover that your entire future has been decided without your consent? That your body, your dreams, and your very soul now belong to a stranger chosen by people who claim to know what is best for you? What would you do if that stranger turned out to be someone who would change not only your life, but the course of history itself? Before we continue with this story that few people know about, I need your help. Comment below where you are watching this video from, and if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, please subscribe now. This channel needs your support to keep bringing these secret stories to light. Stories that powerful people tried to bury forever. In the spring of 1941, in a small reservation near the border between Arizona and New Mexico, 21-year-old Sarah Nashoba stood barefoot on the red earth outside her grandmother's hogan, staring at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set behind the sacred mountains. She had spent the entire day crying, but now her tears had dried, leaving only salt marks on her bronze cheeks and a hollow emptiness in her chest that felt like a physical wound. That morning, the tribal council had made their decision. In 2 weeks, she would marry James Tso, a man she had spoken to only 3 times in her entire life, a soldier who had just returned from basic training and who would soon be deployed overseas with the United States Army. The decision had been made without consulting her feelings, her desires, or her plans for the future. Sarah had dreamed of becoming a teacher, of traveling to the Indian boarding school in Santa Fe to complete her studies, of helping her people preserve their language and traditions in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to their existence. But those dreams had been shattered in a single morning meeting where 5 elderly men, sitting in a circle around a dying fire, had determined that her union with James was necessary for the good of the tribe. There were practical reasons, they explained. James came from a respected family. His father had been a code talker in the First World War, a position of immense honor. The alliance between the Nashoba and Tso families would strengthen important bonds within the community. And in these uncertain times, with war looming on the horizon and the reservation facing increasing pressure from the federal government, such alliances were more important than ever. Sarah understood the logic behind their decision, but understanding did not make it hurt any less. She barely knew James Tso. He was 23 years old, tall and lean with the characteristic high cheekbones of their people, and eyes so dark they looked like obsidian. He spoke little, and when he did speak, his words were measured and careful, as if each one had been weighed and considered before leaving his lips. During their 3 brief encounters, he had been polite but distant, and Sarah had no idea what kind of man he truly was beneath that impenetrable exterior. Her grandmother, Ayasha, found her standing there as darkness began to fall. The old woman approached slowly, her ancient feet moving with surprising grace across the uneven ground. She placed a weathered hand on Sarah's shoulder and stood beside her in silence for several minutes, both of them watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson. When Ayasha finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. She told Sarah that she understood her granddaughter's pain, that she too had once been young and filled with dreams that seemed to shatter like pottery dropped on stone. She told her about her own arranged marriage, about how she had hated her husband for the first year, how she had cried herself to sleep every night and contemplated running away to live among the white people in the cities. But she also told Sarah something else, something that would echo in the young woman's mind for years to come. She said that sometimes the spirits have a plan that we cannot see, that sometimes what appears to be a prison is actually a door to a destiny we never imagined. The wedding took place on a cool morning in May, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon, but no rain falling. It was a small ceremony, attended only by immediate family and a few elders. Sarah wore a traditional dress made of white doe skin, decorated with turquoise beads and silver conchos that had been passed down through 4 generations of women in her family. James wore his army uniform, the olive green fabric, crisp and new, with corporal stripes on his sleeves. He stood straight and still during the ceremony, his face betraying no emotion whatsoever. When the medicine man asked them to exchange vows, James spoke in their native language, his words careful and formal. He promised to honor Sarah, to protect her, to provide for her needs. But his voice was flat, as if he were reciting a memorized text rather than making promises from his heart. Sarah responded with her own vows, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands trembling as she held the ceremonial cornmeal. She felt like she was watching herself from a great distance, as if her spirit had already fled her body, and only an empty shell remained to perform this ritual. That night, in the small house that James's family had prepared for them, Sarah sat on the edge of the narrow bed and waited for her new husband to approach her. But James did not come to the bedroom. Instead, he remained in the main room, sitting at the rough wooden table, cleaning his rifle and checking his equipment. Hours passed. Sarah eventually lay down, still wearing her wedding dress, and fell into an exhausted sleep filled with confused and anxious dreams. When she woke the next morning, James was already gone. A note on the table, written in careful block letters, informed her that he had been called back to his unit earlier than expected. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor 7 months earlier had accelerated everything. His regiment was being deployed to the Pacific Theater, and he did not know when or if he would return. He had left money for her in an envelope, along with instructions on how to contact his family if she needed anything. The note was signed simply with his name. No terms of endearment, no expression of regret at leaving so soon. Sarah stood in the empty house, holding that piece of paper, and felt a strange mixture of relief and abandonment. She had been married for less than 24 hours, and already she was a widow in everything but name. She returned to her grandmother's hogan that same day, carrying the small bundle of possessions she had brought to her married home. Life returned to a semblance of normality, except that now she wore the status of a married woman, tied to a man she barely knew who was fighting a war on the other side of the world. Months passed with no word from James. Sarah learned to stop checking the mail every day, learned to stop jumping every time she heard a vehicle approaching on the dusty road that led to the reservation. She threw herself into work, helping her grandmother with the sheep, weaving rugs to sell to the trading post, teaching young children their traditional songs and stories. She tried not to think about the strange liminal state of her existence, neither truly married nor truly alone, suspended in a peculiar kind of waiting that seemed to have no end. Then, in November of 1942, a letter finally arrived. It was not from James himself, but from a fellow soldier in his unit, a white man from Oklahoma named Private First Class Robert Henderson. The letter was brief and formal, written in the stilted language of someone unaccustomed to expressing difficult emotions. Henderson explained that James had been severely wounded in action on Guadalcanal, that he had been evacuated to a field hospital in Australia, and that his condition was serious but stable. He was alive, but he had lost his right leg below the knee, and the doctors were unsure whether he would ever be fit for active duty again. Sarah read the letter 3 times, trying to process the information. She felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she could not immediately identify. It was not quite grief, because she barely knew James, and their relationship had been imposed rather than chosen. But it was not indifference either. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that this man, whether she had wanted him or not, was now irrevocably connected to her life, and his suffering somehow diminished the world they both inhabited. She wrote back to Private Henderson, thanking him for the information and asking him to convey her concern to James if he had the opportunity. She did not know what else to say. How do you write to a husband you barely know? What words could possibly bridge the vast distance between her life on the reservation and his experience in the hell of jungle warfare? To her surprise, James himself wrote to her several weeks later. His letter was written in pencil on what appeared to be pages torn from a notebook, the handwriting shaky and uneven. He apologized for not writing sooner, explaining that he had been in and out of consciousness for weeks, and that writing with his left hand was still difficult because his right side had also been injured by shrapnel. He told her that he understood if she wanted to dissolve their marriage, that he would not blame her for not wanting to be tied to a crippled man who might never be able to provide for a family. He wrote without self-pity, but with a stark honesty that surprised Sarah with its vulnerability. For the first time since their wedding, Sarah felt something shift in her perception of James Tissot. She saw past the silent soldier, past the stranger who had been thrust into her life by the decisions of old men, and glimpsed someone more complex, someone capable of doubt and fear and humility. She spent 3 days thinking about how to respond, and when she finally put pen to paper, she found words flowing that she had not known she possessed. She told James that she would not abandon him, that whatever their marriage had been or not been before, he was still her husband, and she would honor that commitment. She told him about life on the reservation, about the sheep and the weaving and the children she was teaching. She tried to create a picture of home for him, a place to return to in his mind during the long nights in the hospital. And she asked him to tell her about himself, about his experiences, about the things he had seen and the friends he had made. What followed was an unlikely correspondence that would continue for the next 2 years. James wrote from various hospitals and rehabilitation centers as he slowly recovered and learned to walk again with a prosthetic leg. His letters became more open, more revealing. He wrote about the terror of combat, about watching friends die in his arms, about the weight of killing other human beings, even when they were the enemy. He wrote about the strange camaraderie among the Apache soldiers in his unit, how they had developed their own informal code, using their language to communicate in ways the Japanese could never intercept or understand. He wrote about his dreams and nightmares, about the phantom pains in his missing leg, about his fears that he would never again be whole. Sarah responded with her own letters, gradually opening up about her own feelings, her own fears and disappointments. She told him about her anger at having her choices taken away, about her resentment toward the tribal council, about her confused feelings toward him. She told him about the gossip among the women on the reservation, the whispered speculation about whether her husband would ever return, whether she would spend her entire life in this strange state of married loneliness. And slowly, letter by letter, something unexpected began to grow between them. It was not quite love, not in the traditional sense, but it was a form of intimacy born from radical honesty and shared vulnerability. In the spring of 1943, James wrote to inform Sarah that he was being released from the hospital and would be assigned to a training facility in California. He expected to be given a medical discharge within a few months, and then he would finally return home. Sarah felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach when she read those words. After 2 years of correspondence, after building this strange epistolary relationship, they would finally have to face each other as husband and wife in the physical world. Would the connection they had forged through letters survive the reality of daily life together? But James never made it to California. In June of 1943, he received new orders. Instead of being medically discharged, He had been selected for a special program. The Army was forming a new unit, one that would use Native American soldiers as code talkers, building on the success of similar programs in the First World War. James's proficiency in both English and Apache, combined with his combat experience, made him an ideal candidate. He would be training new recruits, teaching them how to develop and use an unbreakable code based on their indigenous languages. The program was classified, highly secret, and James could tell Sarah very little about what he was doing. His letters became shorter, more cryptic, filled with gaps and omissions that left her imagination to fill in the blanks. He was no longer on the front lines, he assured her, but his work was critical to the war effort. He asked for her patience, for her understanding, and promised that, when the war finally ended, he would tell her everything. Then, in the summer of 1944, something changed. James's letters took on a new urgency, a new intensity. Between the lines of his carefully censored words, Sarah could sense that something significant was happening, something that went beyond routine training exercises. He wrote about dreams he was having, strange visions that came to him in the night. He wrote about feeling the presence of ancestors, about hearing voices in the wind that spoke in the old language, telling him that his path was not yet finished, that there was still something he needed to do. In August of 1944, Sarah received a visit from two men in Army uniforms. They arrived at her grandmother's hogan in an official vehicle, and her heart immediately leapt into her throat, convinced that they had come to inform her of James's death. But instead, they brought a different kind of news. James had volunteered to return to active combat duty. Despite his injury, despite his prosthetic leg, he had convinced his superiors that he could still serve effectively in the field. He had been assigned to a special operations unit, one that would be participating in a critical mission in the Philippines. The officers could not provide specific details, but they wanted Sarah to know that James had specifically requested that she be informed, and that he had asked them to tell her that everything he was doing for the honor of their people. Sarah stood in the doorway, listening to these men with their clean uniforms and official language, and felt something break open inside her chest. This man, this stranger who had become her husband through circumstances neither of them had chosen, was now willingly walking back into hell. And she finally understood what her grandmother had tried to tell her on the night before her wedding. James Tso was not just a soldier, not just a husband forced upon her by tribal politics. He was something more, something that their people had always recognized and honored, a warrior in the truest and most ancient sense of the word. After the officers left, Sarah went to the old medicine man who lived on the far edge of the reservation. She asked him to perform a ceremony, a protection ritual for warriors going into battle. The old man looked at her with rheumy eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, and he nodded slowly. He told her to bring tobacco and cornmeal, to fast for 2 days, and to prepare herself to participate in something that few women were ever allowed to witness. The ceremony took place on a moonless night, in a hidden canyon that the elders used for the most sacred rituals. Sarah sat outside a circle of stones, while the medicine man and 3 other elders performed their rites, singing songs so old that even they did not know all the words, calling on powers that had protected Apache warriors since time immemorial. They burned sage and cedar, created smoke patterns in the air, spoke incantations that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand on end. And when it was finally over, when the fire had burned down to embers and the old men sat exhausted and drained, the medicine man approached Sarah and placed something in her hand. It was a small medicine bundle, wrapped in doeskin and tied with sinew, containing items she could not see but could feel, pulsing with a strange energy. He told her to send this to James, to tell him to keep it with him always, close to his heart. He told her that her husband walked a dangerous path, that he had been chosen by the spirits for a purpose that none of them fully understood, but that this medicine would help guide him and protect him. And he told her something else, something that made her blood run cold. He said that James would face a choice, a moment when he would have to decide between his own life and the lives of many others, and that what he chose in that moment would determine not just his fate, but the fate of their people for generations to come. Sarah sent the medicine bundle to James through military mail, along with a letter that tried to explain what the medicine man had told her. She did not know if he would believe in such things, if his time in the white man's army had stripped away his connection to the old ways. But she felt compelled to send it anyway, to honor what the elders had done, to maintain that invisible thread that connected her husband to his homeland and his heritage. Weeks passed with no response. Sarah continued her daily routines, but now with a constant underlying current of anxiety that never quite went away. She found herself praying, something she had not done consistently since childhood, mixing Christian prayers learned at the mission school with older invocations taught to her by her grandmother. She made offerings at sacred places, left cornmeal and tobacco at springs and rock formations that had been holy to her people for countless generations. In October of 1944, she finally received a letter from James. It was brief, written in obvious haste, but it contained words that she would remember for the rest of her life. He thanked her for the medicine bundle, told her that he kept it in the breast pocket of his uniform directly over his heart. He told her that he could feel its power, that it brought him comfort in moments of extreme danger. And then he wrote something that surprised her with its directness. He told her that he had come to realize that life was too short to leave important things unsaid. He told her that he knew their marriage had begun as an obligation imposed by others, but that through their letters he had come to know her in a way he had never known another human being. He told her that when he closed his eyes and thought of home, it was her face he saw. And he told her that he loved her. 3 words that carried the weight of everything they had become to each other across vast distances and impossible circumstances. Sarah held that letter in trembling hands and wept for the first time since her wedding day. But these were different tears. Sarah wrote back immediately, pouring her heart onto paper in a way she had never allowed herself to do before. She told James that she, too, had come to love him, that somehow through ink and paper they had built something more real and more solid than many marriages that began with passion and romance. She told him to come home, to survive whatever trials lay ahead, because she would be waiting for him, and together they would create the life that had been denied to them at the beginning. But that letter never reached James. By the time it arrived at his last known location, he had already deployed to the Philippines with his Special Operations Unit, and mail was no longer being forwarded to his position. Sarah would not learn this until much later. For now, she simply waited, checking the mail every day, praying every night, holding on to the hope that her words had reached him and that they would give him strength for whatever battles he was fighting. What Sarah did not know, what she could not have known, was that in late October of 1944, James Tissot was participating in one of the most critical and dangerous operations of the Pacific War. His unit had been inserted deep behind Japanese lines on the island of Leyte, tasked with gathering intelligence on enemy troop movements and fortifications in advance of General MacArthur's return to the Philippines. The mission was supposed to last 3 days. It lasted nearly 3 weeks, and what happened during those weeks would become the stuff of legend, though the full story would remain classified for decades. James and his team, consisting of 12 men including 3 other Native American code talkers, had been dropped into the jungle under cover of darkness. Their objective was to reach a position overlooking a strategic valley where Japanese forces were believed to be massing for a counterattack against the American beachhead. They were to observe, report, and then extract before the main assault began. It was a textbook reconnaissance mission, the kind that James had trained for extensively during his time in California. But nothing went according to plan. On the second night, while moving through dense jungle toward their observation post, the team stumbled directly into a Japanese patrol. The firefight was brief but brutal. In less than 5 minutes, 4 of James's teammates were dead, and 3 others were wounded. The survivors scattered into the jungle, trying to evade the pursuit that inevitably followed. James found himself alone, separated from the rest of his unit, with no radio and no way to contact friendly forces. His prosthetic leg had been damaged in the fighting, the mechanical joint compromised, making every step agony. For the next 6 days, James moved through the jungle alone, living on rainwater and whatever he could forage, constantly evading Japanese patrols that seemed to be everywhere. He should have died a dozen times. He came within feet of enemy soldiers on multiple occasions, remaining perfectly still while they passed, his heart hammering so hard he was certain they could hear it. He crossed rivers swollen with monsoon rains, climbed steep hillsides that left his damaged leg bleeding and infected, hid in caves and hollow trees while search parties combed the area around him. During those 6 days, something changed in James. The rational, trained soldier began to recede, and something older, something primal and connected to his Apache heritage, began to emerge. He found himself moving through the jungle with an instinct he had not known he possessed, reading signs in the forest that his conscious mind could not articulate, but his body somehow understood. He heard the voices his grandmother had told him about in childhood stories, the voices of warriors who had walked this earth long ago, guiding him, warning him of danger, showing him paths that were not visible to ordinary eyes. On the 7th day, exhausted and delirious with fever from his infected leg, James finally made contact with another survivor from his unit, a Navajo code talker named Thomas Begay, who had also been evading capture. Together, they made their way toward the coast, hoping to reach the American lines, or at least find a way to signal friendly forces. But as they moved through the jungle, they began to notice something disturbing. Japanese troop movements were not following the patterns that intelligence had predicted. Instead of consolidating defensive positions, the enemy appeared to be massing for something else, something bigger. Thomas still had his radio, though it had been damaged in the initial firefight, and could only receive transmissions, not send them. They listened to coded messages being passed between American units, and what they heard made their blood run cold. General MacArthur's forces were about to launch a major offensive, pushing inland from the beachhead toward the central mountains. But based on what James and Thomas had observed, the Japanese were preparing a massive ambush. Thousands of American soldiers were about to walk into a trap that would make the initial landing look like a minor skirmish. They had to warn someone, had to get this information to command. But how? They were miles behind enemy lines, with no way to transmit messages, no way to reach friendly forces in time. Thomas worked frantically on the radio, trying to coax it back to life, trying to get even a weak signal that might carry a message. But the transmitter was completely dead, destroyed beyond any field repair he could manage. That night, as they huddled in the abandoned native hut deep in the jungle, James made a decision. He told Thomas to continue trying to reach the coast, to save himself and get the intelligence back to command if he could. But James himself was going to do something different, something that made no tactical sense, but that felt absolutely necessary. He was going to sabotage the Japanese ambush. Thomas argued with him, told him it was suicide, that one man with a damaged leg could not possibly make a difference against thousands of enemy soldiers. But James was insistent. He had a plan, or perhaps more accurately, he had a vision. The voices that had been guiding him through the jungle were telling him what he needed to do, showing him a path that defied all logic, but that resonated with something deep in his soul. Before they parted ways, James did something that Thomas would later describe in his own classified debriefing. James took out the medicine bundle that Sarah had sent him, the one he had kept in his breast pocket throughout all his trials. He opened it for the first time, revealing its contents. Inside were items that should not have survived the jungle conditions: a eagle feather, a small piece of turquoise, a pinch of sacred pollen, and a tiny piece of paper covered in Apache, writing that James recognized as his grandmother's handwriting. He read the words, ancient words that were part prayer and part invocation, and then he closed the bundle and put it back in his pocket. Thomas said later that James's eyes had changed in that moment, that they took on a quality that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, as if he were no longer quite human, but something else, something that belonged more to the spirit world than to the world of flesh and blood. James left Thomas that night and disappeared into the jungle. What happened over the next 4 days has been pieced together from multiple sources: Japanese war diaries, American intelligence reports, and later, from James's own fragmented accounts given during military debriefings and, decades afterward, to trusted members of his tribe. The full truth remains elusive, wrapped in layers of classification and the fog of war, but the essential facts are these. Moving alone through enemy territory, James began a campaign of sabotage and psychological warfare that would have been remarkable for a full unit, let alone one injured man. He destroyed ammunition dumps using improvised explosives. He contaminated water supplies. He cut communication lines, booby-trapped trails, created false signs of large American forces. But more than physical sabotage, James became a ghost that haunted the jungle. Sentries disappeared from their posts without a sound. Entire squads reported seeing a figure watching them from shadows. Officers reported morale breakdown, soldiers refusing patrol, claiming the jungle was inhabited by something supernatural. The Japanese had their own traditions of warrior spirits. What James was doing was tapping into those fears, becoming the embodiment of legends that haunted enemy nightmares. He left symbols drawn in blood. He made sounds in the night that mimicked animals, but carried an undertone of something distinctly threatening. On the 4th night of his solo campaign, James achieved his primary objective. He infiltrated the command post, where Japanese officers were coordinating the planned ambush. He reached the tent, where maps and battle plans were stored. He could have stolen them, but instead did something far more audacious. He altered the maps, changing coordinates, moving unit positions, creating a false picture that would lead their commanders to catastrophic tactical errors. He did this while enemy soldiers moved past just feet away. It should have been impossible, but James did it. And when the Japanese launched their ambush 2 days later, they discovered their forces positioned on faulty intelligence. American units were not where expected. Ambush positions were exposed to artillery. The battle that should have been a massacre became a rout. Hundreds of American lives were saved because of what one Apache soldier had done alone. James himself was found 3 days after the battle by an American patrol that almost shot him on sight, mistaking him for an enemy combatant. He was barely conscious, his infected leg now gangrenous, his body ravaged by fever and malnutrition. He was immediately evacuated to a field hospital, where doctors debated amputating his leg even higher, perhaps all the way to the hip, to stop the infection from spreading. But something remarkable happened. Despite medical predictions, despite the severity of his condition, James began to recover. The infection receded, the fever broke, and within 2 weeks he was stable enough to be transferred to a hospital in Australia. During his recovery, James was visited by military intelligence officers who debriefed him extensively about his actions behind enemy lines. He tried to explain what he had done, but even he could not fully account for how he had survived. The officers listened with skepticism, attributed his accounts to fever dreams and psychological trauma, classified his actions as extraordinary special operations success, and quietly buried the more inexplicable aspects in files that would not be declassified for over 50 years. James returned to the United States in March of 1945. He was given a medical discharge with full honors, along with a Silver Star, a Purple Heart, and several other commendations. He was 26 years old, and he had aged a lifetime in the 4 years since his wedding day. Sarah met him at the train station in Gallup, New Mexico. She had received a telegram 3 days earlier informing her of his arrival, and she had made the long journey from the reservation, her hands shaking the entire way, uncertain what she would find when she finally saw her husband in person after all these years. When James stepped off the train, moving slowly with a cane to support his prosthetic leg, Sarah almost did not recognize him. He had lost weight, his face now lean and angular, marked with scars that told stories she could only imagine. But his eyes were what struck her most. They held a depth that had not been there in the photographs he had sent, a quality that suggested he had seen things that could never be adequately described or explained. They stood facing each other on the platform, while other passengers flowed around them. 2 people who were married but who had spent only 1 night together as husband and wife, who knew each other intimately through letters but who were strangers in physical space. And then James smiled, a small, hesitant smile that transformed his face, and Sarah felt something break open inside her chest. She crossed the distance between them and embraced him, feeling his arms wrap around her with a strength that belied his apparent frailty. And they stood there holding each other while the train pulled away, and the afternoon sun painted the desert in shades of gold. They returned to the reservation together, to the small house that had stood empty for 4 years. The tribal elders held a ceremony to welcome James home, to honor him as a warrior who had brought glory to his people. But there was something else, too, an undercurrent of unease. The medicine man watched James with eyes that held questions. Old women whispered, making signs against evil spirits when James passed. Children stared at him with a mixture of awe and fear. Sarah asked her grandmother about it. The old woman said that James had walked a path that few men had ever walked, that he had gone to places between worlds, that such transformations always carried a price. Power borrowed from the spirit world never came without cost. Sarah began to notice things about James that confirmed something fundamental had changed in him. He moved differently, with a fluidity that seemed to defy his injured leg. He knew things he should not have known. He woke screaming from nightmares, babbling in languages Sarah did not recognize. On those nights, she would hold him, and she would see in his eyes a darkness that terrified her. Despite these disturbances, James and Sarah built a life together. They had 3 children. James worked various jobs, never holding one for long, always restless. He became a respected member of the tribal council. He rarely spoke about the war, except to other veterans. The full story of what he had done remained classified by the military and guarded by James's own reluctance. But stories began to circulate anyway. Thomas Begay came once in 1952 and spent 3 days talking with James. When Thomas left, he told Sarah that her husband was a hero who had saved countless lives, that the Apache people should be proud. But Thomas also told her to watch over James carefully, that men who walked the paths he had walked sometimes lost their way back to the living. The years passed. The children grew. James aged, but something about him remained unchanged, vital and fierce. And there were whispered stories about strange occurrences that seemed to follow him. Hunters reported seeing a figure in the mountains that moved like smoke. People claimed animals behaved strangely around him. Even wild creatures seemed to sense something that marked him as different. In 1968, when James was 49 years old, an anthropologist from California came to the reservation, researching Native American participation in World War II. She interviewed James extensively. During those interviews, James spoke more openly than he ever had before about his experiences. He described the voices he had heard, the visions he had seen, the moments when he felt himself becoming something other than human. One late-night recording contains an exchange that was later cited in academic papers. The anthropologist asked James directly whether he believed he had been possessed or transformed by spiritual forces during his time in the Philippines. James was silent for nearly a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, deeper. He said that possession was the wrong word. What he had experienced was a remembering, a reconnection with aspects of his heritage suppressed by centuries of oppression. In the jungle, facing death, he had rediscovered what it meant to be Apache, to be a warrior in the ancient sense. And once such knowledge was awakened, it never went dormant again. The anthropologist asked if he would do it again, knowing the cost. James's answer was immediate. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Because what he had done had saved lives, had honored his people, had proven that the Apache way was not dead, but merely sleeping. James Tso died in 2003, at the age of 84. By then, enough time had passed, and enough documents had been declassified that his actions in World War II had become more widely known. He was honored at military ceremonies, featured in documentaries about Native American code talkers, celebrated as a hero by his tribe and his nation. But those who knew him best, who had lived with him and loved him, understood that the story was more complex than any official history could capture. Sarah, who survived him by 7 years, sometimes told their grandchildren about the man she had been forced to marry, about how he had become someone she could never have imagined on that day in May of 1941. She told them that James had walked between worlds, that he had touched something sacred and terrible, and that such journeys always left marks that never fully healed. The medicine bundle that Sarah had sent to James, the one that had protected him through his trials, was buried with him, placed over his heart in the traditional way. At the funeral, the current medicine man performed ceremonies that dated back centuries, songs and rituals meant to guide a warrior's spirit to the place where ancestors waited. But there were also newer elements, prayers spoken in English, hymns sung by the church choir, references to Jesus Christ, and the promise of resurrection and eternal life. The old ways and the new ways mixed together, just as they had mixed in James's life, creating something that was neither purely traditional nor purely Christian, but something uniquely suited to the complexity of being indigenous in the modern world. In the days following the funeral, several people reported seeing a figure in the mountains near where James had been buried, a man who moved with impossible grace across terrain that should have been impassable. Others claimed to hear singing on the wind, old warrior songs in the Apache language, carried from nowhere and going nowhere. The reports were dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations, as the kind of stories that always circulate after the death of someone significant. But among the elders, among those who understood such things, There was quiet acknowledgement that perhaps James Tissot had not entirely left the world, that perhaps part of him remained, watching over his people, ready to rise again if the need arose. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the wind carries voices from the past, you can still feel his presence in the mountains and deserts of the Southwest, a reminder that heroes never truly die. They simply wait, patient and eternal, for the moment when they will be needed again. But we must ask ourselves, what kind of power did James truly access in that jungle? And is that power still there, waiting for others to find it? The question remains unanswered, hanging in the air like smoke from a ceremonial fire. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be, because some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but only to be remembered and respected. May we all find the strength that James found. May we all honor our ancestors and our traditions. And may we always remember that true heroism comes not from violence, but from sacrifice, not from taking life, but from protecting it. And may we turn our hearts to God and to Jesus Christ, who guides us through our darkest hours and brings us home when our battles are finally done. They wait in the sacred mountains, patient and eternal, watching with eyes that never close.